When it comes to neuroplasticity and ME-CFS, there appear to be two strongly polarised camps. On the one hand, you have those who say that ME-CFS is only a hypersensitive nervous system issue and that all you need to do to recover is to practice brain retraining. And on the other, you have those who say that that's basically totally unscientific, pseudoscientific even, and a complete waste of time. My name is Patrick Ussher and I am author of the book Understanding ME-CFS and Strategies for Healing. And in a conversation with Dr. Eleanor Stein, we are going to discuss what we think are the mistakes in both of these camps, and instead how you can have a more accurate and balanced understanding of where brain retraining can fit into efforts to improve, or perhaps even to recover, from a highly complex illness like ME-CFS.
Welcome to the Dr. Eleanor Stein Podcast. In this show, you will hear expert medical professionals, researchers, and people with lived experience share science-based, low to no cost strategies to help people with complex chronic diseases. Listen in for another dose of education, empowerment, and hope. Hi there, I'm Dr. Ellie Stein, and welcome to the Dr. Eleanor Stein Podcast. In this new podcast, I bring together diverse and sometimes challenging views about complex chronic diseases. Today is no exception. My guest is Mr. Patrick Ussher, and we're going to discuss the promises and the limitations of neuroplasticity-based practice in ME-CFS, long COVID, and related diseases. A brief intro about Patrick, who I've been getting to know now over the past few years. He's got such an interesting background. So before becoming ill with ME-CFS 7 years ago, he had many accomplishments in far-flung fields. He has a BA and an MA in classics, and that means ancient Greek and Latin from the University of Exeter. He's written a book on Stoic philosophy. I have to admit to barely knowing what that means. He's also a music composer in the contemporary classical style, and his work is available for you to listen to on Spotify. Now, as you can imagine, since becoming ill, Patrick has focused his efforts on his own recovery, learning as much as he can about these conditions and sharing what, more importantly, perhaps sharing what he's learning with the community. He's written a very interesting paper on the potential causes of excess thirst in ME-CFS and long COVID. And most recently, he's written a comprehensive, well-balanced book called Understanding ME-CFS and Strategies for Healing. And I'm sure we're going to delve into that book on more than one occasion in our conversation. In it, he takes a deep dive into the work of Professors Klaus Wirth and Carmen Scheibenbogen, explaining in easy-to-understand terms their compelling and slightly complex hypothesis that brings together and integrates many disparate research and clinical findings in ME-CFS, things like hypoperfusion, mitochondrial dysfunction, and autoimmunity. Patrick also has a YouTube channel called Understanding ME-CFS, in which he talks in an accessible way about many of the very diverse treatment strategies that he has tried. And I have to say, he's one of the more open-minded people I've met in the field. He's tried a lot of different things. Patrick is originally from Ireland, and he's lived both in Ireland and in France, where we find him today over the course of his illness. So for today's topic about neuroplasticity-based practice, unfortunately, a polarization has occurred in this field. One camp says that the only problem causing ME-CFS is a hypersensitive or overactive nervous system, and that therefore, all you need to do to get better is some kind of brain retraining. The other, equally extreme camp says that brain retraining in ME-CFS is unproven, pseudoscientific, and at worst, nothing better than quackery. My hope is that Patrick and I can look at these polarized views, talk about some of the strengths and the weaknesses that we see in each of the views, and come to some kind of middle ground. Now, I know that Patrick has some personal experience with neuroplasticity-based practice, as do I, and I thought maybe to just kind of lay the groundwork, we could each share a little bit about our personal experience to give the listeners just an idea of where we're coming from. And Patrick, of being the guest, I would love you to go first.
Okay, well, thank you, Ellie, and thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
You're
Um,
welcome.
well, yes, I have had experience with neuroplasticity, both in terms of actually recovering from these kinds of illnesses and also not recovering. So go back to 2014, 2015, and I actually had a first round of ill health. I had postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, multiple chemical sensitivity, and fibromyalgia. And in 2015, I came across the dynamic neural retraining system. I did that program with the very best of my ability, and I actually had a very straightforward recovery. And at the time, it felt a bit like magic. I went from being pretty ill to hiking for 16, 18 kilometers a year later.
Wow.
And I managed to put these things behind me. I was well for 3 years. And then, unfortunately, thanks to some extreme stress that I suffered with for some time, I became ill again. And this time it was more with ME-CFS. I've had some orthostatic issues. Interestingly, I've never had chemical sensitivity or fibromyalgia again. Um, but I have definitely had autonomic disturbances and noise sensitivity and excessive adrenaline release and those kinds of things. Now, the thing is that this time, even though I've gone through long periods of practicing neuroplasticity, and sometimes I have to say I don't practice it, but I've had months at a time where I do, is that actually it's helped, but it's never got me beyond a certain point. So it will help me with things like the autonomic nervous system feeling haywire and dysregulated, or the noise sensitivity, or being super stressed about just about anything. But with the exercise intolerance and post-exertional malaise, it's basically never done anything for me. So I often wonder why that is. We can maybe dive into what
Mm-hmm.
stops some people from making progress with neuroplasticity, because clearly some people do recover using it and other people don't. And I have ideas on that. But, it's helped me with stabilizing the nervous system, but it has not helped me with the key ME-CFS symptoms. And so that's been my experience this time around. Useful, but I'm not over the hill. What
Great.
about
Thanks for
you?
sharing that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, um, I guess there's some similarities maybe in our experiences. So I also used the DNRS program in 2014. So very close kind of in time to your experience. And what I noticed first and really dramatically was an improvement in chemical sensitivity. And that's a symptom I had had since childhood. So I actually didn't go into it with much expectation that it would change. Both my parents were chemically sensitive. I have all the bad, DNA SNPs for chemical sensitivity. And yet within a week, I was much, much less sensitive. I could start going to places that previously would really cause me a lot of distress. And the great news is that's 10 years ago now. Those improvements have just continued to strengthen. So, at first I said, well, I'm 80%, and then I said I'm 90%. So just to give you an idea, I just flew back from the Galapagos Islands yesterday. My taxi driver, the day before, I met up with him numerous times because he was shuttling me around to all kind of different locations. And he had, I counted them, 7 of these like air freshener items, right, in his car. Like it reeked and I felt totally fine. Like I didn't like the smell. It was strong and like bizarre mixture of different fragrances and pretty overpowering, but I didn't feel unwell in any way. So to me, that's, a really big deal because it means I can just go about my life without even having to worry about fragrance. Um, I would say it helped me somewhat with pain, although I've done some other things like prolotherapy that I think maybe have been more contributory. And like you, it really didn't help at all with energy. The thing that's helped with energy and PEM, in my opinion, because of course you never know these things for sure, right? Is diet. So, and I know it's not for everyone, but for me, I'm on record as saying the paleo autoimmune diet is a real game changer. And as long as I stay on it, my energy is fantastic. You know, to give the same example of the Galapagos trip, I was going straight from morning till night for 9 days, like on excursions, snorkeling, sometimes more than once a day, getting up at 4:30, 5 in the morning to get out on the boat. And I felt totally fine for the entire time, energy wise. I know that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been sticking to my diet. So when I teach neuroplasticity, because as you know, I have a couple of courses, I let people know I think that certain aspects and certain symptoms are more likely to respond than others. And this is my opinion, and then I'll kind of throw it over to you. The symptoms that are most likely to respond are those for which the brain plays the largest role. So when we look at pain, you know, there's just masses of research that chronic pain is generated by the brain due to neuroplasticity. And therefore, if we use neuroplasticity, you know, in a careful, planned way, we can reverse those changes. And I think the all kind of sensitivities, like you said, the dysregulated nervous system, sensitivity to light, to noise, to EMF, to smells, all of those things are very brain related. And I think are good symptoms to target with neuroplasticity based practice. Other things like fatigue and post-exertional malaise, I view in many people are what I call mixed. So for fatigue, for example, we know that fatigue has many peripheral causes, like the cells not having enough energy. And I don't think any amount of neuroplasticity based practice is going to magically make the cells create more ATP. Um, but there is a central aspect to fatigue, which I learned about 20 years ago when I was involved in a research study where the brain has to, just like with pain, the brain has to perceive whether the body has enough energy to function or not, and it can sometimes misperceive. And I think if that's the case, and I'm not sure if there's a way to prove, like in an individual, um, you know, I don't think I can tell, oh, this is what we call central fatigue, meaning my brain might be misperceiving, versus peripheral fatigue, meaning I just don't have enough ATP in my cells to function. But to the extent that the brain is at all misperceiving the amount of energy we have, then I think some improvements could be gleaned with the neuroplasticity approach. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I really do agree with you on everything you said there, Ellie. And for me also, I think it's the most obvious way in which neuroplasticity can help is the sensitivities.
Yeah.
Because if you think about it, things like light, noise, and smell sensitivity, like what part of our body is processing those senses? You know, it's in the primitive parts of our brain. And so if things have gone into a maladaptive neuroplastic state there, it makes a lot of
Mhm.
sense that targeting those areas can lead to quick changes. And that was my experience as well with the sensitivities. And even now, you know, if I crash these days, I often become noise sensitive.
Mhm.
But if I spend an afternoon doing some nice visualizations or meditating, the next day the noise sensitivity can have gone away.
Wow.
And you know that's that kind of yeah. It just ties in with where you're directly targeting, and then the elements of the illness that are almost like PTSD, which I think is you could say is happening in a way, or even worse than PTSD sometimes, I think can
Yeah.
also respond really well to these interventions. And then when it comes to things like, you know, the cellular level and what's going on there, I think that there may be ways that it can influence it.
Hmm.
But there are so many layers of dysfunctions that develop in ME-CFS. Um, Technically, they may be secondary dysfunctions, but they can be so powerful that they really set in and impede someone's progress.
Hmm.
Um, and I think when those things have set in, like the low blood volume, like autoantibodies, which can go into the blood vessels and stop them working well, or like microclots, which can really slow down and make the circulation sluggish, then the cells are having to deal with this environment, which is really struggling. And you're doing the brain retraining, but all these secondary things are in place and they're not kind of going to lift overnight.
Yeah.
Far from it, actually. And so you still have the cellular issues and the PEM and the fatigue.
I don't know if you'll think this is a good comparison or not, but I sometimes think of cancer, which we all agree is a biomedical disease. And in the lead up to cancer, there's so many things we can do, right? Diet and lifestyle, clean up the diet, get rid of toxins, exercise, lose weight, all these things that, have a ton of evidence. But once the cancer has grown to a certain level, those things, although still influential, are may not be enough to reverse those changes that are, I'm going to call it like the horse has left the barn or some kind of metaphor like that. And I kind of think of that a little bit with ME, like you say, once all those layers, like, the blood vessels are damaged and the autoantibodies are flying around the body and the B cells are overactive and the T cells are depleted and like all of this stuff, I think it's going to take a much more comprehensive biomedical and holistic approach to really turn the table, turn the tide.
Yeah, I think so. And from my own perspective, on when I see people recovering from ME,
Hmm.
I think often, actually, just anecdotally, but often what they've managed to do is not crash for a very long time. And
Hmm.
I think that that is actually that gives their body the
Hmm.
chance to heal these secondary dysfunctions more than just, okay, let's make the brain, let's untraumatize the brain. I think it's
Yeah.
that healing time which really does need a long period, a good long stretch to happen.
And I gather the German researchers have I don't know if they've done a study on that but they talk about that in their work. And I also think of, the pretty old study now by Professor Leonard Jason, where he showed people that stay within their energy envelope for 6 months, their energy improves, right? And people that repeatedly crash and just keep overspending or depleting their reserve, they don't get better. So I think there's some evidence to support what you just said.
Yeah, I didn't know about that study, but that's very much in
Hmm.
line with, I've watched lots of these recovery stories, and so
Yeah,
often people say they found their safe baseline. And yes, the researchers I talk about in my book, Wirth and Scheibenbogen, they actually have an explanation for why the post-exertional malaise can actually cause muscle tissue death. So this is a very good example of what is not talked about in the brain retraining circles.
yeah.
Sometimes these coaches come along and they say, post-exertional malaise, that's all created by your brain and your nervous system. And it's just your nervous system telling you to stop and nothing is actually happening. Well, guess what, guys? No, that's not the case. When you crash, the research actually shows that the mechanisms that get activated then cause the muscles to die. And they
Hmm.
are regenerated, but it's a really laborious and unpleasant process. And so whenever you're in PEM, it's just such a major repair job that people have to do that there's no, I think, real chance of recovery if you keep crashing.
Yeah. I don't know if it's a little bit outside our main discussion, but I'd love you to give, if you wish, kind of a encapsulated summary of some of Wirtz and Scheibenbogen's work. I'm sure I'm butchering their names because my German is extremely poor. So apologies out there, but just because I think it's such a beautiful model. We don't know for sure whether it will be the model or maybe, which aspects of it will turn out to be true and maybe which not. But You put a lot of work into that in your book, and it was very compelling to me when I read it.
Yeah, sure, Ellie. So, yes, that's one of the main aims of my book is to really explain their model because I find it very compelling. I find it really exciting. So, what they did something different. That's the first point to make, which is rather than, and by the way, this is not in any way to do down all the wonderful research up until now, but the research has tended to kind of look for specific problems in different parts of the body. So people will investigate what's going on in the blood or what's going on in the muscles or the cells or the brain.
Yeah.
And they'll write a paper and they'll say, we found this problem. This is going on. And that's very, very important. But what Wirth and Scheibenbogen did is they came along and actually said, what can explain why all of these things are happening at the same time? Why is this happening in the brain? Why is this happening in the muscle cells? What's the relationship between the two? And how can we join up the dots, basically? So they wrote a unifying model of ME-CFS, and I think it's brilliant. It really explains why X leads to Y leads to Z, and Z leads back to X as well. So it paints ME-CFS as an illness of vicious cycles in which everything initially seems random, but actually they're all connected. And it covers everything. It talks about the blood hypoperfusion because of low blood volume, which they worked out why that's happening most likely. Vascular dysfunctions, the microclots, autoantibodies, cellular issues like what we were just discussing in relation to the muscle tissue death and post-exertional malaise. Everything joining up together, which I think is a wonderful model. And perhaps even more excitingly, even though it'll take a while yet because medical research takes time, is that Klaus Wirth is trying to develop a pill based on this research. And that pill is called Mitodicure. And it will be working directly on the cellular dysfunctions that cause the post-exertional malaise and the muscle tissue death. And in principle, it could actually make it physiologically impossible to crash, which would just be an enormous game changer because then, just like we were saying, post-exertional malaise keeps people in it. If you have a pill to stop PEM, then their bodies could put healing resources into the other issues. So it's a very exciting model, which I think has huge potential for the future.
And maybe what we'll do, Patrick, is we'll put a link to their paper in the show notes so that it's pretty intense paper, but people who want to read it can do so.
Yes, that sounds good. And also people can read the blog I've written for your community about the post-exertional malaise and the Mitodicure, which is coming out now as well.
Yes, good point. So when this podcast is published, Patrick has graciously written the guest blog to kind of introduce some of their work. Thank you. So let's shift over to neuroplasticity. How do you view what neuroplasticity is? Like the definition or what's actually going on in the brain?
Well, it's when the brain's structure changes in response to experience or specific exercises. The brain is constantly neuroplastic. So it's always changing in response to our daily life and what we do and how we live. But it can also change in response to actions we specifically take. So just, an obvious example is learning to drive a car. Initially, you have to think about everything, but then after a while, it becomes subconscious and the brain has actually learned those behaviors. Similarly, learning a musical instrument. These are examples of neuroplasticity in action. So when it comes to ME, I think that there is this negative neuroplastic state that's ongoing, that's kind of traumatized the brain and creates these sensitivities and nervous system dysregulation. And so the question then becomes what to do about it if you can actually target that using specific exercises.
Yeah, and just to add to what you've just said, one of the things you've kind of hinted at it, but maybe just to make it really clear, is that neuroplasticity, I call it neutral, meaning it's not good or bad. So many people say, oh, neuroplasticity is the solution to everything. But but it's actually also the cause of many things. So when we develop chronic pain or sensitivities, it's because the brain is, for whatever reason, rightly or wrongly, sensing that it's in danger and kind of spending more and more energy trying to warn us of that danger by generating symptoms. And so I kind of have a bit of a motto that anything neuroplasticity causes or generates neuroplasticity can help resolve.
Yes, that
So
makes a lot.
it's bidirectional, like it can go either way.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Maladaptive and positively adaptive, or whatever the term would be for the other direction.
And then I think we were going to, one of the questions I had for us to discuss, I think we've already touched on, which is what are some of the clues that neuroplasticity may play a role in ME? So for people that are really against that idea and not willing to look at it, there's like, no, ME is just in the body. It's all about the cells and the blood vessels and the hormones and et cetera. What would you say are some of the hints that suggest that neuroplasticity may be playing a role?
Yeah, great question. So in addition to the sensitivities that we've already discussed, which I think are,
Yeah.
really clear, there are papers that look at what's going on in the brains of ME patients, and they do find problems to do with, structural changes.
Yeah.
And I talk about one of these papers in my book, but there's a great team out in Australia led by Tapalia, and he did some studies looking at the brain. And for example, he found that ME patients had larger amygdala sizes. So that's the part of the brain, particularly to do with fear and fight or flight. Smaller parts of the brain to do with attention, capacity to pay sustained attention. And also, interestingly, that the parts of the brain that allow you to visualize images in your mind's eye were also smaller, which is interesting because I've noticed since I've become unwell that my imagination lost its vividness. So these kinds of areas, also problems in the brain stem, the more autonomic areas,
Yeah.
kinds of issues there. So we see that these things are happening. They have something biological is going on. And so I'd say to someone who's doubting these things, if you were to look at a paper from other neurological illnesses or illnesses with neurological involvement, you would see that these are real issues if they're showing up on scans. And, I often think of the example of people who've had a stroke and they are relearning how to use an arm through neuroplasticity or another limb or whatever. And they can do that. And so we wouldn't dismiss that. I think we shouldn't dismiss the possibility that neuroplasticity could play a role in these sort of biological problems that have been found in the brain. And what I think is really interesting about them is that they don't seem very random, these problems. Like they're very much to do with the nervous system, to do with kind of more primitive parts of the brain, or to do with the kind of stress response. It's not like it's the part of the brain to do with, I don't know, something more like moving limbs or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's more to do
So
with what.
you're saying the changes in the brain are not general. They're not throughout the entire brain. There are these very specific areas.
Exactly. They're more
Okay.
specific. They're what you'd expect for someone if they have a traumatized state. So they are the bigger amygdala, the lower attention span, worse executive function. So they're what you would expect for the sensitized brain rather than something random.
That's really interesting. Thank you. One of the things I really loved in your book, Understanding ME-CFS and Strategies for Healing, you kind of lay out some of the arguments, I'll say critique of the opinion that neuroplasticity-based practice can cure, is causing and curing everything about ME. And then you lay out equally as thoughtfully the arguments or critique for the opposite point of view, that it's totally unscientific and we shouldn't spend any time thinking about it. And in the first case, you talk about the top 5 mistakes in the narrative that ME-CFS can be fully cured by brain training. And I'm just wondering if you could mention some of those for people, because I found them quite interesting.
Yeah, certainly. So when I see people saying that ME-CFS is only a hypersensitive nervous system issue, I find that very concerning. I think it's doing patients a disservice because they have a right to know what's really going on in their body. And it's doing the researchers a disservice because they're putting huge painstaking efforts into unraveling what is a very complex and often very severe illness. So yeah, I do talk about various things I have concerns with. So one is simply that it's just untrue. I mean, we just know so many aspects of what's going on in ME, like the low blood volume, for example. I like to point to that because one study showed that ME patients can have a liter less blood, particularly if they're housebound, sometimes even 1.5 liters less if they're very severe. And so to come along and say, this is just a hypersensitive nervous system is doing those more severe patients a huge, huge disservice. And I think it can be dangerous. One of the other big mistakes I think that they make is they talk about the sensitized brain as if it's happening all on its own. And what they don't recognize is that once the other mechanisms in the illness, the so-called secondary mechanisms, but once they set in and set in and set in, they can actually feed back into the sensitized brain and cause it to be even more sensitized. So it's not happening on its own. For example, the low blood volume, the brain really freaks out if it doesn't have enough blood to work with, right? It's like, what is this? It's super, super stressful.
Yeah.
And I found that when I treat my low blood volume, my nervous system calms down.
Yeah.
Another example is autoantibodies. So there was a really interesting study by Iwasaki where she took the plasma from long COVID patients and injected it into mice. And the plasma contained the autoantibodies. And so the mice suddenly had all these autoantibodies going around them, and they actually developed dysautonomia simply from the autoimmune problems. And so, you just don't know necessarily what's causing, all the aspects of this. So those are a couple of good examples of how the other aspects feed back into the sensitization. And then another issue I have with the way that the typical ME-CFS brain retraining narrative is that it is far too close for comfort to the biopsychosocial model. Now, I don't necessarily think these people, the brain retraining coaches, know that they're doing this, but the biopsychosocial model, essentially says that the issue is just, false illness beliefs, sickness behavior, and deconditioning, and that people just need to have a more positive mindset and build themselves back up and they'll be fine. And this has done a lot of damage to so many aspects of the ME world as well as patients. But, a lot of the brain retraining coaches are actually saying something, it's different emphasis, but it's a little bit similar.
Yeah. Can I jump in there? Because I would love the chance to kind of talk about that exact point.
Sure.
So I'm a psychiatrist, and in psychiatry, since like the 1970s, we've used something called the biopsychosocial model, and the reason that was brought in as being so important is to let people know that the biology, the psychology, and the social, meaning people's socioeconomic status, family relationships, culture, all of that stuff, are all major contributors to mental illness, because this is in psychiatry. Nowhere does the biopsychosocial model say that it's all in your head. In fact, it was developed in the 70s when research started uncovering some of these very biological contributors to mental illness to say, hey guys, this isn't all in your head. Biology is really important. And, we tend to totally ignore social circumstances, like maybe you're depressed because you're in an abusive marriage or like all of these things. So when people use that term as a pejorative, I, who have been using it for 40 years in a very different context, kind of go, you know what, that's not actually the true meaning of that term. Just like people now use cognitive behavior therapy as a pejorative, but it's actually a very credible evidence-based therapy for many things. It was misused and abused by, we'll call it the British School of Psychiatrists in ME, right? To say all you have to do is change your thinking and you'll get better. That's clearly false. But I just want to put a plug in for biopsychosocial in its true original meaning, which is to actually emphasize and validate that biology is really important, that even mental illness doesn't arrive like out of nowhere magically based on our thoughts. It's because our thoughts through neuroplasticity, back in the 70s, that was not even a, kind of a commonly understood term, but it's through neuroplasticity. So if I think about things over and over, for example, my illness is incurable, my life is miserable, there's nothing I can do. Unbeknownst to me, because of neuroplasticity, I'm actually hardwiring and strengthening pathways of hopelessness. And all of the neurotransmitters and neuromodulators and neuropeptides and hormones associated with hopelessness are being constantly activated. And this is how the mind and the body are connected. So I just want to, it was the one thing in your book I just kind of went, oh, I hope I get a chance to talk about that biopsychosocial is actually saying the stool of whatever illness we're talking about, whether it's primarily one that manifests with mental symptoms or primarily one that manifests with physical symptoms like ME, there's 3 legs to that stool and all are important. I don't know what your reaction is to that.
I really appreciate you describing the biopsychosocial model in its original form and in a more comprehensive way. And I have to say that, I've just kind of taken on the more pejorative sense, and I can now see that there is a larger perspective to it, which makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that sometimes when people talk about the biopsychosocial model in relation to ME and they're angry about it, if from what you're saying, if the biopsychosocial model were to be applied properly, the bio part would be really focused on a lot more. And
notice it's first.
It's
bio is the first part of the term, right? It's not like it's an afterthought. So they put it first to really emphasize, guys, we got to start thinking about biology. Yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly. So that's very helpful for me to know that bigger perspective. And I think that maybe there's a better way of describing that British school that has done damage rather than using biopsychosocial
I think if
model.
we called it maybe, even psychosomatic, like all these terms have become pejorative and almost you're not able to even say them without getting throwback. But even psychosomatic, what that's basically saying is the mind and the body are connected. And if you change the mind, it's going to impact the body. And if you change the body, it's going to impact the mind. So to me, that's not a pejorative, it's just a truth. The mind and the body are they're not even separate. Like I would love to even move past even talking about mind body, because really there's no magic dividing line, somewhere in the neck. Like our whole being is one.
Yeah, our brain happens to be situated in the body, and it's up, as part of that. No, I really appreciate these points. I think that what you're drawing to is the true original meanings of these words. I mean, I have no problem with what you said about psychosomatic there in that sense. The problem is that, of course, most people in society don't think of it as meaning that. They think it's
right.
it's actually it's attributing mental illness to what they're suffering or whatever,
Yeah,
something like that.
absolutely.
So I appreciate the distinctions that you're drawing there.
Great. Are there any other of those, before we kind of move on to the polar opposite, any other points you want to raise that are maybe problems with the neuroplasticity-based practice can cure everything model?
I think that I think just very briefly, I'll just say I have some concerns about some of the pricing of these programs. I think
Hmm.
that we all have to make a living, and there's nothing wrong with wanting a comfortable living, but some of them are very expensive, and are reports that, of even $6,000 being the cost of some
Wow.
of them. And I just think that that's not appropriate for the ME-CFS world, basically. So personally, I would regard any kind of excessively priced program as a red flag, and I just would like to say that to people.
Yeah, thank you. And so if we turn to the other side, um, so the people who say anything to do with neuroplasticity is unscientific, mistaken, and wrong. And I would say online, there's such a backlash that anyone, including myself, who talks about neuroplasticity as having any legitimacy, can be soundly criticized. I've heard of cases through third parties of people that have really left the internet entirely because they've just been really treated in a very disrespectful manner.
Yes, and for me, like I think the most important thing is to ask ourselves, what's the truth of a situation?
Right.
And the fact is that some people recover using neuroplasticity. It's a fact. And other
Yeah.
people improve even if they don't recover. And so if we're going to be scientifically minded, we actually have to ask, why is it that people recover using these things and not hide away from it, not say it's inconvenient? You know,
Hmm.
we need to actually know and not just, have this knee-jerk reaction and say, we don't want to. We don't want to go near that. So for me, ironically, even though these people are often saying that it's unscientific, let's ignore it. They're actually being unscientific by not getting curious about why it is that some people recover.
Right. I know of a couple of studies underway. One is looking at people who have either recovered or who have had substantive improvement and is trying to kind of catalog and look for trends. What did they do? How did they do it? What's improved? What hasn't improved? Were there any adverse effects? And then, of course, there's always the plea for research. Is there any evidence? And I know you point out in your book, there are a couple small studies of the Gupta program. I agree with your analysis that unfortunately each of them has some aspect that makes it a little bit less convincing than what we would like. I think by the time, I hope I can say by the time this podcast goes to air, that the study I'm involved in will be registered with clinicaltrials.gov. So it'll be out in the public eye. We've been working on it for 10 years. You can imagine in the current environment, getting funding to do a study like this is challenging, but we finally accomplished it. And we're hoping to do a super well-designed study. The researchers on the team, most of them don't have any axe to grind. They're not in the field whatsoever. So they're expert researchers who have decided this is an area that deserves, like you say, open-minded study to see, are people going to get better or not? And if so, how? So
Well,
I think this will be the first announcement of the study.
that's super exciting. I didn't know you were
Yeah.
in that, Ellie. I'll be fascinated to see it. And 10 years is wow, what an effort to get it.
Yeah, I mean, that's just to get, to really build up the team and to build up, some initial papers. You have to put out little papers to show that you have credibility, et cetera, to be able to get funding. So
Well, I hope that that it will be considered in a more open-minded way and not just
Hmm.
rejected in this kind of knee-jerk fashion. Um, my feeling is that a lot of that knee-jerk reaction is actually because when these people think of neuroplasticity, they think of the first camp we've been talking about, and they think of all the problems
Yes.
within that camp, and so they just think, no, 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 we don't want to go near that, rather
Yeah.
than saying, neuroplasticity is used in other illnesses. How can we think about this more accurately? How does this actually fit into the pathophysiology? I mean, why shouldn't it be involved, a maladaptive
Hmm.
neuroplastic state? I mean, it makes 100% sense from the symptoms that it is. So yeah, I hopefully your paper can actually move the discussion towards, yeah, a more
And
balanced.
maybe we'll find it helps and maybe we'll find it doesn't help, which for for our team, we feel is equally as important. Like if it's really not making a substantive difference, that needs to be out there in the scientific literature so that physicians and other researchers know that information, and patients maybe won't be spending exorbitant amounts of money on programs that aren't going to work.
Exactly, because a lot of these programs, and they can be useful. I mean, they show
Hmm.
people's recovery stories, and that's very interesting and inspiring sometimes. But what they're not doing is collecting data and, portraying the full picture of what happens when people do their programs. So, it might be the case that on average, people improve 20%, 30%
Hmm.
from using these things. And we need to know that. And that's still useful and it could still be helpful for someone to try and improve that much.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I wonder if there's anything else. Yeah. Oh, I know what I was going to ask you. At the end of your book, you kind of talk about your own personal neuroplasticity program that you've developed for yourself, and you had some really interesting strategies there. I was wondering if you'd be open to sharing a little bit about it.
Yeah, sure thing. So, yeah, I've developed two or three, which I
Hmm.
found really helpful and consistently help with softening the nervous system symptoms. Um, the one that I find the most fun, which I would
Okay.
encourage anyone to try, is what I call the art of inner conversation.
Oh,
So,
this sounds like what I do. Go ahead. I'm so interested.
okay, cool. So this is basically it came about one day where I was thinking, a lot of these brain retraining programs, you're always waiting to respond to the negative or traumatized thoughts. So you wait
Right.
for it to come up, and then you're like, stop, 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 etc., etc. Um, but what I wondered was, what if I took a period of time and actually thought about non-traumatic, sweet, interesting things over that, let's say, half hour or hour, and didn't let the negative thoughts come up in the first place? Would that actually be more effective in kind of challenging these traumatized
Hmm.
neurons? And so I would maybe think about, for example, my favorite TV series, which I would say is Curb Your Enthusiasm. I'm a huge fan of that.
That's
With
the name of the show.
Yeah, it's Larry
Curb Your.
David. Larry David.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
I've been
It is
traveling. I don't have a TV. Yeah.
fair enough, but it is always guaranteed for me to be very, very funny. So
Okay. Fantastic.
um, I will think about, episodes that I've watched. I'll think about the plots. I'll think about the things that I found funny. I think about just, what I like about the actors, what I like about the way they do things. They go off script in the series, which is really
Hmm.
nice. I'll think about anything I can get into my head about the program, and I'll just spend 20 minutes doing that. And during those 20 minutes, I have not allowed the traumatized state to exist.
Hmm.
So I find this to be really effective, um, rather than just always responding it's like
Hmm.
rewiring in advance is
Yes.
what I call it. Um, so doing that, and what's really interesting about it is when you start doing that, you actually, your brain works by association. So it starts to think of other things that are similar or that you'd like to think about. And so I bring these things together. And what I also like about it is it's not impersonal. So a lot of the visualizations that people do in other programs, they're kind of they can be impersonal, not necessarily,
Yeah.
they can be. Whereas this is thinking about things that, that you've really liked, or um, I think about my life story. I go through different years of my life. I think about what happened, or everything I can think about in relation to a friend or whatever. So it's things that are personal to me, which makes it a lot more engaging, and it doesn't really feel like an exercise. So that's been the most fun way that I've actually, yeah, gone about brain retraining.
That's so interesting because I also found the repetitiveness and kind of relentlessness, of yes, every time something negative happens, oh my gosh, now I'm in for 20 minutes of this. So I find using imagination and creativity the most fun, and that it's taken me 10 years, but sometimes I actually look forward to my practice now. And I create these kind of imaginary scenarios that I want to have happen. So I'm trying to prime my brain for the health and the life that I want to have. And there's always something, right? So even if you're in quote unquote 100% health, none of us lives a perfect existence. So I've been working on, my mindset and, sometimes like, for example, I did a lot of rehearsals on going to the Galapagos and how it was going to work great. And I was going to have this much fun and that much fun and what I was going to see. And, a lot of that happened. For those of you listening, I just got back from 9 days in the Galapagos. It was amazing. So yeah, I find that really fun because I'm not very good at doing repetitive things like, say, meditation.
Mm.
It hasn't really worked for me. So I was really challenged to try to personalize the practice and make it be something that I would look forward to and actually do. Because there's different sayings in the field, like the best practice is the one you actually do, right? It might
Right.
not be the perfect one or the one that's being researched, but if you do it you have to practice daily to keep those new neural pathways forming and strengthening. So that's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that. I'm wondering, just to wrap up, if you would like to say something about your book. I mean, we've kind of touched on it, especially things like is it for sale? Is it available? Yep.
Yes, it is for sale, and we'll have a link in the show notes for
Okay.
where you can buy the book. But it's on Amazon, it's on Barnes and Noble, it's on Kobo Books. It's available ebook, it's available paperback. It's also available in audiobook on Kobo Books, and also
Wow.
my own personal website, or the website for the book, which is understandingmecfs.com. So yeah, it's out, it's available. It covers some of the most exciting research, I think, including what we've touched on today.
Yep.
Talks about lots of different things, from diet to the spine to the Buteyko method, which has really helped me which increases carbon dioxide levels in the body, to neuroplasticity, to my crazy adventure in Germany where I got my black blood washed, and it became red again, thank God. So all of these things are covered in the book, and I hope people find it useful.
I thought those, because you have photos in the book of your blood before you underwent the treatment and after you underwent the treatment. And I was like, a picture really is worth 1,000 words. And I think anyone who thinks it's all about neuroplasticity or oversensitized brain just needs to look at those photos to go, what, these are very complex diseases with multiple aspects of the mind and the body being involved.
100%. I mean, I encourage
Yeah.
people to seek out those photos, because my blood was actually black before I
Yeah,
started.
it's shocking.
It was shocking. It was absolutely shocking. And it was black because of all these microclots. And I think I could have done brain retraining till I was blue in the face, and that would not have resolved.
Yeah. If people want to reach you, Patrick, what's the best way to do that?
The best way to do that is my website,
Okay.
patrickussher.com. And also, I have my YouTube channel, as you mentioned, Understanding ME-CFS.
Thank you so much. This has been really fun, which I love when there's kind of some commonality. And I think both of us will be really interested in what I'm going to call constructive, respectful feedback. So if you're listening or to this podcast on all the podcast channels, or if you're watching it on YouTube, I really welcome your feedback as long as it's constructive, right? Something that's joining both of our efforts to work towards some kind of integrative model that's really going to help people get meaningfully better.
Yes, I'm also interested in that feedback. And I think that what we've talked about, touches on what a lot of people raise questions about, and
Yeah.
when you see people talking about neuroplasticity. So I hope it will be helpful from that point of view and bridge a gap.
Yeah.
And it's a real pleasure, Ellie, to chat to you today. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me on the Dr. Eleanor Stein podcast. I hope you are taking away new strategies and ideas to improve your health and a renewed sense of hope. Join me, Dr. Eleanor Stein, for our next episode. Can't wait? Check out my website for a wealth of free resources.